Hey everyone, welcome to the Ceres podcast. I'm your host Stelios, the founder and director of Ceres. Today we have a special guest, Alan Simpson, Deputy CEO of UKHospitality, the leading organisation for the £140 billion hospitality sector. Alan's expertise in politics and economic development makes him an invaluable guest. After my conversation with Alan, I felt enlightened and relaxed, which is rare when discussing politics around election time. To give you a bit of backstory, about a month before the general election announcement, I discussed the idea of covering major parties' policies and how they could affect hospitality on the Ceres blog and the Ceres podcast with my advisors and mentors. They had concerns, but they said I should give it a go if the dialogue and analysis could remain completely objective. It's been hard, but we have put out numerous articles whilst trying to remain completely unbiased. And when I say it's been hard, it is really hard because only, words really matter, because you don't want anybody thinking that you're trying to sway people's minds. You just want to give the information and let people make their choices. We always aim to have thoughtful discussions, and while staying objective can be challenging, it's crucial for keeping our content engaging and informative. And above all, we are an intelligent community and industry, and we can listen, learn and read, and then make our own decisions. A bit about our guest. Alan has an impressive background. From 2018 to 2023, he was with London & Partners, serving as Managing Director of Strategy and Operations, and later as Interim Chief Executive. He played a crucial role in London's recovery post-pandemic. Prior to that, Alan led Barclays Bank Business Finance Policy Team, focusing on trade, SMEs and scale-ups. He's also advised the CEO and Chairman of the London Stock Exchange during the financial crisis. Alan has held various government roles and was Labour's parliamentary candidate in Maidstone and the Weald in 2015 and 2017. Today's episode of the Ceres podcast is brought to you by the Ceres Natural Degreaser, the ultimate solution for turbocharged cleaning. This powerful, no-nonsense degreaser effortlessly tackles the toughest grease stains. Despite its natural composition, it's incredibly effective. The Ceres Natural Degreaser is a potent powdered formula designed for professional kitchens. It cuts through grease as effectively as corrosive cleaners without the harmful side effects. Our non-tainting, perfume-free and dye-free formula ensures a clean, neutral finish, performing excellently in all water conditions. It's economical, biodegradable and non-caustic, making it a safer choice for your cleaning needs. You can also dissolve the Ceres Natural Degreaser in water for a pre-soaking solution, which is perfect for stubborn stains. It removes various stains from clothing and cloths, including coffee, blood, grease and you name it, anything. Who benefits from using the Ceres Natural Degreaser? Well, it's ideal for fish and chip shops, restaurants, hotels, street food vendors, catering establishments. The list goes on. It's perfect for degreasing kitchen floors, work surfaces, especially getting rid of proteins like fish juices or meat juices off surfaces, from walls, kitchen equipment, cookers, cooker hoods, fryers, you name it. And one of the key things it also does, it's really good in potato peeling rooms because it can really neutralise the starch and break it down when it's going down the drain, which is really important. So visit www.ceres.shop for next day free mainland UK delivery. We also ship to Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, the British Isles and numerous European countries. Stay connected with Ceres, follow us on social media for the latest updates, sign up for our mailing list via the link in the episode show notes, and then you'll just get the direct updates to your inbox. And if you want to chat about things, join our Ceres podcast discussion group. We hope you enjoy this episode with Alan Simpson from UKHospitality, and I think you'll find the common theme is that most things are pretty possible, but only if the economy grows. So I'd be very interested in everyone's feedback after hearing this episode. Alan, welcome to the Ceres podcast.
Stelios, how are you? Hello.
I'm great, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard a lot of good things from Kate.
I can't believe that's true, but I'll take the compliment.
So, how is it all going? You must be very busy over there at UKH Towers.
Yeah, it's not quiet. I think a lot of us were trying to figure out when we thought the election would be. We knew the government wanted to try and creep to November. We thought they might not be able to, but it's a bit like, did you ever play Buckaroo as a kid? You sat there waiting for the donkey to go off, and then 4 weeks ago it did. So we are 5 weeks ago, is it? 5 weeks ago. So we're recording this exactly a week away from the festival of democracy that is the 4th of July.
Yeah, and we're hoping it will be out for the weekend, because I'm going to work really hard on this, but to be fair, there probably won't be a lot of work. I rarely edit anything, which causes me problems down the line. But were you expecting like a snap one though? Like, did you think, it could pull it out? Because I think everyone's become like political science majors at this point. We all think we know everything, and I don't think I was expecting it, if I'm honest.
Well, we knew the government wanted to try and make it towards the end of the year. As much as anything, if you're Rishi Sunak, being in power for 2 years feels a bit better than being in power for 18 months, doesn't it? So there was a lot of logic that they try and get to the autumn. Interest rates would have started to come down, inflation would be back at target, and so on and so forth. But it was always going to be politically difficult because there seems to be a bad news story every week. There's a point where all governments get to where they just can't catch a break, and even quite moderate things get written up negatively. So the question was always, could he get there? He didn't, and he called an election. I don't think we were expecting it to be the 4th of July, but I don't think we were surprised that it was a bit earlier than the government wanted it to be. Ultimately, when you are that far behind in the polls, there's not an obvious good point to call an election, is there?
It's true, and I think we'll get onto polls shortly, but I feel like he's had a little bit of good news lately. Like, I know we won't know because it's a shower of shit out there because it's an election, but it does feel like, that he's probably to some degree been a little bit vindicated. I don't want to say massively because there's some people that are still struggling. There's a cost of living crisis. But I don't know, was he hoping that this would give him some wind behind his sails?
Well, the timing for the announcement itself was when the inflation data got to within a margin of error around the Bank of England's target, right? So, yeah, absolutely fair to say that the underlying macro data for the economy is better than it was 18 months ago. And, to the extent that the Prime Minister is responsible for inflation, he has every right to feel vindicated. I mean, certainly he'd take the blame if it hadn't gone back to that 2% target, more or less. But equally, there are some things which are still coming down the track. There's still a lot of the country who are going to get their mortgage increase at some point between now and next summer. Never forget that most people who own homes don't have a mortgage at all. But the people who do have mortgages, a lot of them were on sort of 3-5 year fixes, which the final bulge of those was coming due. My own mortgage is coming due between this summer and next summer. So there are probably just as many things which made the Prime Minister think, is it getting better, or are there more challenges down the road?
Do you think there's a part of them that thinks, we'll call an election, we'll make it look like we're doing a good job, but let's just let Labour get in for the next 4 or 5 years so we can just come back and fight hard from the other side in 5 years' time?
Well, I mean, there's two things politicians say when they lose elections. The first one is it's a time for renewal. You can go into opposition, you can renew your thinking, you can set up think tanks and think big thoughts about the future challenges of the economy. The other thing politicians say is that being in opposition is rubbish. Any day in government is better than your best day in opposition. I think probably both of those things are true. I'm fairly sure they'd rather win than lose, but yeah.
There's a lot of tough decisions being made. It doesn't look like it, but I think it feels like no one's, and we're going to discuss these policies, but no one's throwing us really great policies, and I think that just shows us the tightness of the times. That there isn't a lot of movement here.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the manifestos are more similar than they are different. I think that's true. I'm very struck by the area. We'll come on to the detail, as you say, the areas where there's real overlap, partly because Labour's response to almost every Conservative announcement has been to say, fair enough, try not to have significant water between the two parties, but also because the fiscal reality is the fiscal reality. We are coming out of a pandemic which has had dramatic impacts on cost of living. We are in a world where there's two significant conflicts going on, which is having dramatic impacts on the cost of goods, inflation. But equally, there was 145-ish billion pounds worth of direct subsidy to businesses, which the government provided during the pandemic, through furlough and other things. And I don't think we can underestimate the fact that whoever is in charge over the next generation really is faced with the same fiscal realities. You can have very different opinions on the extent to which you address that by investing in growth or shrinking so that you can reduce taxation, or none of the above. But the fundamental maths of running the UK government isn't changing whoever's in power. So it's probably not a surprise that there is broad agreement on the window of available action for a government.
I do think that the word COVID isn't mentioned enough. And
yeah.
I don't know if it's because people are sick of it or the fact that they see it as an excuse, but I don't think people were complaining too much anyway when Rishi Sunak was handing out the money at the time. And I remember him saying as Chancellor, like, this is public money, we need to be careful, we've got to balance the books right. And I think maybe some people thought he was being a bit too sensible at the time. And then a friend of mine, he said to me at the time, he goes, it's good that they're doing the furlough, it's good that they're doing all the bounce back loans, they're giving the grants at local level. However, he said, and my friend's quite old and wise, not old, he's older than me and wise, I don't want to put him down, but he said, people won't thank them in the future for it. He goes, they'll get used to the handouts and they won't thank them. And I do wonder, is this now, are they going to be punished for the past,
Yeah, it's a good point. Governments, by the way, never get the benefit, the credit for what they've done. That's true of all outgoing governments. Will all say it's not fair, look at everything we achieved and we're not getting the credit for it. That was true of the Conservatives in '97. It was true of the Labour outgoing government in 2010. There's you said at the beginning, everyone's a political scientist now, much as we were all epidemiologists during the pandemic. But there's this lovely phrase in American political science, which in the modern era feels a bit sexist, but you get the point of what's being said. They talk about the mummy-daddy problem, which is that when people feel nervous, they tend to vote for the Republicans for daddy, whether that's because the economy's doing badly, because there's a military threat, whatever it is. And when the economy does well, people tend to vote for the Democrats, to vote for mummy. So the mummy-daddy problem, it feels, very gendered language now. But there's this really curious thing. If you look at the UK political scene in the 20th century, say, Winston Churchill wins the Second World War, instantly loses an election to the Labour Party. In 1997, you had the economy go through a very difficult period, was starting to grow. You're out of a sort of an economic war, if you like. And the Conservative Party who'd steered the country to that growth instantly lost power to the Labour Party. So there does seem to be something true about the fact that being responsible for winning the war, if you like, or the pandemic in this case, doesn't necessarily give you massive electoral benefits. But I think to your friend's point, you don't get the credit. People won't thank you for it. That's very human nature, isn't it? We take the money when it's handed to us, but we like the wine. We don't like the hangover.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think, from a broad point of view, I mean, a lot of business groups, fish and chip groups and, restaurant groups and so on Facebook, you name it. And And I think one of the common recurring themes I see is that when things are tight and, there's inflation, everyone's moaning that the government isn't doing enough. And when things are a bit better, they moan that the government's in the way and doing too much.
Yeah.
And how does a government ever balance that?
Well, to a degree you can't, can you? Because you don't have universal winners and losers. So, if you take cost of living, for example, well, for a fish and chip shop, you need customers to have enough money to have fish and chips as a treat on a Friday night. So you want people to have good incomes. The problem is that money needs to come from somewhere, and it either comes from the government through furlough, which means ultimately taxation, or it comes from employers through raised wages, and particularly perhaps a raised minimum wage. So to a degree, it's like trying to cover a double bed with a single duvet. If you pull the duvet in this direction, the other side of the bed gets cold, and vice versa. I think what smart businesses ask for, I think, is probably stability, and knowing what the future price is going to be for your unit prices, for your input prices, but also the affordability for customers, and being able to kind of say, well, okay, I can see that this is what's happening to prices. I can see that this is what my customer demand is. Then you can build a business model that's sustainable. But what isn't sustainable is the swing, as we've seen in the last 2 years perhaps, from food price inflation being very dramatic to coming down. And obviously far from all of that is to do with government policy. Most of it's external, but that's what makes it very difficult to run a business, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah, it's a real tough one. And I think also it's not as clear cut as it was years ago. Like, I think one thing that I've come to learn, and I'm 40 this year, is that British politics, or British people, very rarely vote for extreme rights and extreme lefts. The opposition for a brief period might be extreme right or extreme left, but they very rarely get voted in. If you look at New Labour, they were New Labour, which were very sort of centre, let's say centre-left. And then you had David Cameron, which, and George Osborne, which was sort of, they weren't that far right. Although they did bless us with austerity, but I feel like that it's not as clear cut. We don't really go that far right. Even Margaret Thatcher wasn't that far right at the beginning. Everyone makes out she was, but I don't think she was.
No, and again, since we're all political scientists now, that every single election in modern British political history has been won by the candidate that the country believes is closest to the centre. So whether or not that's sort of the centre right or the centre left, where a part of a centre right or centre left has been faced with an opposition further from that midpoint, they've won. There are no exceptions to this rule. Partly that's just because of the fact we have first past the post, and it's very difficult to get a foothold in Parliament. So if you look at the election on the 4th of July, which we are speaking before, you will find that there are some parties who have a massively disproportionate number of seats. So Labour will have a far higher percentage of the House of Commons than they have of the popular vote, almost certainly. It could be as much as 70% of the seats in the Commons against kind of 40-45% of the vote. A party like Reform will potentially have no seats, or if Farage wins in Clacton, 1 seat against possibly 20% of the vote. That is entirely possible. So one of the interesting things about the fact that we have a first past the post is that unless you can convince a lot of people everywhere to support you, you don't get seats in Parliament. So that means that parties of the centre dominate in the UK in the way they don't in other countries. And of course, we're seeing in France a really interesting case study with the fact that Le Pen has been able to get traction in France in the way that the UK hasn't. And we don't have a party like Le Pen's, and there is a reason for that.
It feels like a lot of countries are taking a lurch to the right at the minute. I was in Norway a few weeks ago, and I was chatting to a few people there, and they were saying that they're seeing a lot of movement in that direction. it seems to be that, people just want something quite extreme at the moment. But again, I've never really seen that in the UK.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's traditionally, the cliche that we get more right wing as we get older. So, and there's lots of reasons for that. One is, when I'm 40, you said you're coming up to 40, I'm 41.
No, I am 40, yeah.
Oh, okay, so you're 40, I'm 41. You get to our age and you start to sort of listen to music and think, I don't like that very much. I preferred the old music. So there's a bit of that. There's a bit of the fact that owning assets tends to make you a bit more conservative because you think, well, I want to literally conserve what I have. In the UK now, we're in a situation where the younger generation is not getting more conservative. So the probability of somebody our age voting conservative, actually, the data shows we probably don't. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, so people our age probably would vote conservative. And a lot of that is probably to do with the fact that our generation is the first generation not where most people haven't been able to buy a house in much of the country, for example. But in the UK, people are not getting more right-wing and more likely to vote for the Conservatives or perhaps Reform. In other countries, that's not proving true. The younger generation is actually pivoting to not just to the right, but actually to the further right in a way that's really interesting. And I can't account for what that difference is, because many of the underlying economic challenges of the younger generation are the same.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we'll ever change the way that the politics in the UK is. I think it's always going to be a two-party thing. I just don't see that ever changing, and I don't like the way that the coalitions form in a lot of parts of Europe. I think that weakens great ideas. I'm from Cyprus. Well, my family's from Cyprus, and every election begins with what looks like great ideas, but the problem is everyone always votes the same way because their families voted a certain way. And then there's coalitions that are done deals at the last minute, and nothing ever truly gets done.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the criticism of those more, you'd have to say, democratically representative approaches where you genuinely can vote for because in the UK you basically have to vote for which of the limited set of parties is closest to what you think. So the systems that you're describing are more democratic, but of course the criticism, as you say, has always been that it's harder to have a government with the ability and permission to get things done. So, but it depends what you prize, doesn't it? It depends what you prize. But equally, one of the things which is very valuable about the UK system is its stability. Yeah. So I remember talking to some friends in America after we had the very brief Liz Truss government, and observing that it was only 49 days after which almost everything returned to where it had been really quite quickly. So there is something about the UK which is able to absorb challenges and respond to them really quite quickly. So, I mean,
I think whatever people say, and as bad as things have been, and for us, what our level of bad, I think we have to understand that it's an economy and a country that's built on a very solid footing. We might think it's terrible in our minds, but it is actually built on a very solid foundation. And I think that's why that 40-odd day blip, yes, it was. And actually, was it as big as what we thought it was? The media, was it a storm in a teacup? Are we ever going to really remember the damage that it apparently ever did to the economy? I don't think we will. I don't know, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I just think that, like you said, it's returned almost back to normal. And, I don't know. I just think that sometimes the media do create a big storm in a teacup.
Yeah, I mean, set aside the Truss premiership, it is interesting that often during crises, the UK proves to be quite resilient. So it was true in 2008 when we had the financial crisis. There are very few countries which had as severe a direct impact of the financial crisis as we did. But in the months and years afterwards, a surprising amount of activity went through the London financial scene. because we were seen as blue chip, we were seen as stable, we were seen as safe. And there is something about the UK's economic, financial, social settlement that means in a panic, in a challenge, the world sort of trusts us to navigate a way through it. And, to a degree, I'd say for hospitality, for leisure, for tourism, that's what's happened after the pandemic as well.
Do you think to some degree, maybe this is because of the success of the UK as such, do you think that the British, and I'm British, all of us, do you think we'd like to self-flagellate to some degree, tell ourselves off and constantly say how bad we are, be sorry for everything we ever did, when really we're just doing our thing, like...
Yeah, I mean that's true. I suspect that's true. I mean you say you're Cypriot, your family's Cypriot, British Cypriot. Yeah. So you're born over here, but you have family maybe still there. Do you?
Yeah,
do you have uncles,
uncles?
Yeah. I sort of think about my friends overseas and my friends with family overseas. I think everybody that I suspect is a human universal. We manage all to be incredibly patriotic and at the same time convinced it's going worse for us than for anyone else, and I'm not, somewhere between those two things is the truth. But the UK, we are a very resilient society, very resilient economy, really resilient culture, partly by the way because of the fact that we've always hosted influx of new ideas from around the world, whether that's our banks being very largely set up by Italian immigrants, whether it's people bringing new cuisines here, which have become huge sectors in their own right. It's amazing how much the UK has just been a place where innovators from across the world have come, often during crises, and built a life and brought change.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I couldn't, disagree with that anymore. It's just interesting. The whole thing just, when you try to sit down and think about it all, I love the UK. I couldn't live in Cyprus. I'd like to visit every now and then for brief periods. But, I think that we've got it good over here. You work hard, you move up. Yeah, I really do. And, I think that it offers everybody a fair chance. Now, could some of those levels be adjusted every now and then, possibly, and I think that's where that all comes out in the wash, doesn't it? With these elections, I would imagine. I think, Alan, I think one of the things I'd say is we've started off without a bio, but what is probably evident to people is that you know a little bit more than me about this sort of thing. So tell us, our listeners, a little bit about how you got to where you are at UK Hospitality, because I think you're giving away a lot more information that we understand at the moment.
Sure. Well, I mean, potted bio, I'm from Maidstone in Kent, county town of Kent. I have had a career which has taken in Parliament, some civil service roles. I then joined the city in 2008 at the start of the financial crisis, went to the London Stock Exchange and Barclays. And then I spent 5 years during the pandemic and the Brexit period as Executive Director and then Acting CEO of London & Partners, which is the economic development agency for London. It's got offices around the world in India, China, Europe, North America, and they bring high-performing companies to London to set up and create jobs. But it also runs the Visit London tourism agency. And in that role, I met Kate Nichols, the Chief Executive of UKHospitality, who was the industry chair of our London recovery marketing campaign, Let's Do London, and she and I worked very well together. And she asked me to come and help her prepare UK hospitality and the sector for a Labour government. Also worth saying that I have my own failed political career. I've run for Parliament twice down in Maidstone with what I can only describe as partial success. So it's a sort of hobby of mine, losing elections. You've got to have a hobby, and I'm very bad at golf, so I do this. And if I could just very, very quickly, if you want to peer into your own soul, if you want to know the sort of person you are, being stood on a stage in a local sports hall at 3 a.m. while they read out the result, and you're given the exact number of people in your local area who don't like you very much.
Well, I guess if you're looking out for that figure, it must hurt.
Yeah, my wife, who was very involved in the campaigns. I remember once the first time around for Parliament. When we got off stage, having had the result, it was light outside, and she just popped me in the car, drove me to McDonald's, and gave me an Egg McMuffin. So, I mean,
I like your wife already. McDonald's, like, what a treat.
Exactly.
But I do, on a note though, this is not to make you feel better, but I do think that local MPs, and although it has nothing really to do with it, local councillors, I think they take an absolute beating because of national politics. I really do. And councillors should really have nothing to do with it because it should be devolved to some degree. But when people feel slighted from what a national policy, they really do take it out. And I see this locally here, like our local MP, Craig Tracy, nice guy, local guys from the next town. Works really hard, genuinely works really hard, and he's probably going to get voted out. But you see the comments on his social media, like the comments, the vitriol. Oh, you never post. Now it's an election, you post. And this guy's probably posted for like twice a day for the last 4 years, and I don't think people care. Like, I just think they're upset. And this, it's not just now. It could have been in 2008. It could have been any time when things have been tough. I think people want to punish MPs, and the way they can do it is by not voting for them. Like, even if
it's such an issue. And by the way, it's worse if you are a woman. It's worse if you're ethnic minority. It's worse if you are gay. The way that politicians are treated is a real worry, because of course it means that a lot of very talented people don't bother. Because you can make an awful lot more money doing something else. You can have a much quieter life. You can work normal hours. Politicians have to work a 7-day week, and often they're working well into the evening as well. And they get dog's abuse, and it's not helpful. You get the politicians you deserve, and if you, as a society, and we've all amongst friends said not very nice things about a politician, but if we as a society treat politicians as the problem, they will be the problem. So I totally agree with you.
I have an unpopular opinion that I will share, that I've probably shared before. I think MPs get paid too little, and I think our Prime Minister gets paid too little. And I don't care which party you're with. I don't care which side you're on. If the Prime Minister or President, I can't remember which one it is, of New Zealand is getting over $400,000, $500,000 for a country with a fraction of the size of our economy, that tells you something is tragically wrong. And I think, and it's not because they should make loads of money while they're in power, but I almost feel like they need to be paid enough so they don't look elsewhere. That they don't have to have these silly scandals of, they put Sky TV through. Well, just, build a benefit package, pay them well, and let's stop having this ridiculous argument all the time. It's just constant. Like when Boris Johnson got in power and they were talking about, how much it costs to refix the flat, and it's just like, this is really tedious. We shouldn't be having this conversation. We're a major country, and it should be set in stone rather than, a grey area, and then, Boris has to go get money from elsewhere, which he's always going to do, isn't he? So I think it's silly. It is really silly that a country of this size and stature leaves their MPs in that sort of situation. And I know they're not on the breadline, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that, but it's just silly. It is really silly. And like you said, they do work 7 days a week. They can be thrown out of office at pretty much any time. They're not, they don't get the job rights that most every other employed person gets. So, they can't just go on holiday, because if they do, they get called out on it. They're almost like it's like indentured servitude for 4 years if they're in power for that long, So I don't know. I just feel like it's a hard job, and it is, because we're always emailing them and nagging them, and they're on social media 24/7 now, which they never were back in the day. So when do they ever get to switch off?
Yeah, I think that's right. Interestingly, if you go back to the Victorian period, the first proper, which was the end of the Victorian period, I think the first proper salaried prime ministers who were getting proper salaries were earning an equivalent to about £500,000 now, I think. So, yeah, I mean, that's a lot of money, and I don't think anyone's suggesting that's the right way to go. But it is, if you can't, and of course we have to be careful, because even a MP on £90,000 is earning significantly more than the national average, but they're earning, for a senior London-based job, a lot less than they would in the open market. They are not earning enough to have a family house in London, and therefore a lot of talented people think, well, if I'm not going to be able to afford my mortgage, and I and my family are going to get abuse on social media and in the street often, then you can imagine a lot of very talented people, particularly women, particularly people of colour, think, I'm not going to put my family through this, and it's an issue.
Yeah, and even if we ignore other prime ministers and presidents around the world, the fact is, a CEO of a council or a mayor of a council shouldn't be getting paid more than the prime minister of the UK. That just doesn't make sense.
No, it's strange, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very strange. But again, it's such an unpopular opinion. Like, I would imagine if we did a local poll today, like 1,000 people, and said, should MPs get paid more? I'd imagine that 99.9% of people say no. So, it is very unpopular. But we can't fix everything, can we, Alan? And
no.
But you guys at UK Hospitality have been thinking about, 6 things or so that you want to sort of, ideally the next government you'd like them to implement. First 100 days is reform business rates and reform apprenticeship levy. First 100 weeks, support businesses with staff costs, support green investment, and then for the whole term, or ideally sooner, reform planning rules and reform VAT to be like Europe. Do you think, wide question before we get on to that, do you think any of the parties get hospitality? Do you think it's on their radar?
I think it is more than it has been in the past. I've always had this really strong opinion that hospitality isn't taken seriously enough as an economic sector. So, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. I think sometimes it's as simple as snobbery, that there's a tendency to look at the sort of sectors where you need a PhD to go into it and think, oh, well, those are the sectors we have to focus on, aerospace, fintech, whatever. But actually, the unique thing about hospitality is, even aside from its economic value, and hospitality is due to grow many times faster than the rest of the economy in the next few years, it has 3 major benefits, right? It creates places people want to live. So it creates places where there is social meaning, that there's cohesion, there's things to do, whether that's the last pub in the village, which is the only thing keeping that village a village rather than a collection of houses, or whether it's big cities where the excitement of the hospitality offer creates a place where people want to live. And you can see up and down the country where retail is moving out of high streets, and it's hospitality moving in and making those places work. The second thing is it creates places where people want to work. So there's a lot of sectors now where it's very, very hard to get into them unless you come from a certain sort of background, you had access to a certain sort of education. The thing about our sector, which I think is so important, is that it provides jobs for everyone everywhere. Whether that's a single parent or a student who needs flexible work around their other responsibilities, or whether it's a young person who left school having found traditional education quite difficult, but goes on to be trained as a sous chef or a pastry chef or front of house, or go into corporate leadership in one of the bigger organizations, or maybe owns their own businesses. There's very few sectors which provide that sort of open access and speedy development. And then it creates places where people want to invest. I said I ran a trade and investment agency for London for 5 years. when we used to go around the world and talk to fintechs, what we used to say to them was, come to London because your business will grow and the coffee's good. You can't convince people to move to your city unless they believe they and their staff will like it there. So that's increasingly understood, I think, by politicians. It's not perfect. We are always fighting a battle to stop them looking at the shiny thing down over their shoulder. But I do feel that if you look at the manifestos, one of the big areas where there was total overlap between certainly the Liberal Democrat, Green, actually all of them really, all of the major UK manifestos, was the need to focus on how you support high streets and particularly hospitality. So I think we're in a better place than we were.
Yeah, no, and I think high streets are just absolutely decimated for hundreds of reasons. I think sometimes the likes of Wetherspoons they don't get enough recognition because a lot of the times they're the only ones sort of left in a high street, and they invest in very old properties and they build them back up, oftentimes listed buildings. I've never eaten in one. That's not because I'm a snob. I've just never had the opportunity. But I think that everyone sort of gives them a real bad rap. And, the guy openly supported, Brexit, let's say. And I think that's one of the main reasons why many people don't like him or don't accept his voice. But I think really any government, the one that's in now or the one that's in next week, they should really be listening to business leaders like him and saying, what could we do to these town centres? And, and I think, it does say a lot about hospitality because down the road from where I am, there's a little town, and a few years ago they decided to make it pedestrianised. Then they had lots of park and rides. It's only a small town, probably 20,000 population, and then a few little park and rides, but basically free parking everywhere as well. And people park their car at home and walk in or get the bus, or they park and they just enjoy the town centre. And what have they got in the town centre? Lots of restaurants.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And there's a there's a kind of bigger point here, isn't there? So because we there's been a lot of chat over the last 4 years about the work from home phenomenon. Really, it's more accurate to say we're living from home. So a lot of people are, and by the way, of course, I mean people in white-collar office jobs, because my wife's a nurse. She can't work from home. If you're a plumber, you can't work from home. If you're, I don't know, if you do the bins for the local council, you can't do that over Zoom. But for the people who do work from home, of course, a lot of us we're working from home 3 days a week. But it's equally important to say that there's other things we're doing from home. So maybe instead of going out to watch a film, we're watching the film on Netflix or on Sky, rather than going out for a drink, we're ordering in we're getting a bottle of wine in from the supermarket. We are maybe having a takeaway rather than going out for dinner. But the one thing we're doing more than anything else, the thing that is true of the whole of society almost, is that we're shopping from home. So retail in a lot of the countries is, as we know, in enormous difficulty. There are entire high streets in some parts of the country where almost every shop is shut because we're buying at home. We're just having stuff sent to us. Now, the problem with that is obvious. A lot of local shops are owned locally, so that means the money stays locally, whereas if you buy from an online business, well, the money just goes to, their San Francisco head office via Ireland. What hospitality does is two important things. One, it survives that process better than retail because you actually can't have the same experience at home with a bottle of Plonk Sauvignon, from Tesco on your own on the sofa that you can socializing. So it's doing very well in and of itself because it's experiential. But the other thing it does is by pulling people out of their house, it helps the rest of it. So shops which are next to successful tap rooms, cafes, fish and chip shops, whatever, are doing better. I sort of think about being up in Buxton last year. Buxton's a great, lovely, beautiful place, but like one of those places where fantastic Victorian Georgian architecture, but you could imagine was struggling for a while. But there's 2 or 3 really great restaurants, tap rooms, places like that, which young people have set up. They probably got very cheap rents. They turned them round. They did something interesting in them. And suddenly people are coming into the town centre again to go there, and they're spending money elsewhere as well. It revitalises town centres. And it's a unique role, I think, to hospitality.
No, I'd agree. It creates a buzz about the place. Nobody wants to live in a place that, closes at 5 o'clock. It's not a nice place to live. And, I lived in Cyprus for a year, and the village was just like that. At 3 o'clock, everything started to close. So, yeah, it's not a buzz. It doesn't, so, yeah, I think, and if a culture can get behind something like that, then that's a nice place to be as well,
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think what we're going to see as a big trend over the next few years is that there's 2 kind of, if you like, almost conflicting or contradictory things will do quite well. One is anybody who finds a way to make delivery profitable properly. So, and that's not easy because the platforms take their price. If you try and do it yourself, it's how do you reach your customer? It's not an easy thing. But people who can make delivery profitable, that's one set of people who do very well. The other one is anyone who can offer an experience, because we as a sector need to stop thinking about ourselves as competing amongst each other. And of course we do have to do that. Of course, come to my restaurant, not their restaurant. But mostly we're all competing against Netflix and a supermarket gastro meal deal.
Do we want as a society, on the broader level, do we want the aggregators to do better? Like, I don't mean at their loss. I don't mean at their loss, at their peril. But I mean, if we want people to go outside and pick things up and see people and go to the local chip shop and buy a bottle of wine next door and go to the local curry house for a takeaway, we talk about being in a cost of living crisis, but I've not got the data. But I saw an article the other day that tells me that Deliveroo's numbers are up, Uber Eats numbers are up, and yet we're in a cost of living crisis. And I don't understand. I'm not an economist, but I don't understand how those 2 things can work side by side. How, a lot of people tell me the young, and this is a very simplistic view, but the young generation today will never be able to buy a house, but they're ordering pizza 4 times a week from Domino's, and everyone's reporting higher figures for those services. If we want people to go out and spend money in a restaurant, or also pick up a takeaway and then go and get a bottle of wine, and that's the antithesis of sitting at home watching Netflix and getting a delivery off Uber Eats. I don't know if they can all work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think the aggregators like Deliveroo, one of the things they have done is that they've meant, as society has kind of retreated inside its house, restaurants have been able to follow them. So the only thing that means my local Chinese restaurant survives right now, I suspect, is that the aggregators mean that they are selling more as takeaway than they were before. And the reality is that we have gone into our house. We have retreated onto our sofas and into our laptops and into Netflix. And delivery means that restaurants can follow people, and Just Eat and others can follow people into the house. The economics of that are complicated, of course, because running any platform, that means that almost any house anywhere in the country can from you order whatever you want to your house inside 40 minutes. That's expensive, and there's a lot of risk. The question for me really is the broader one that you raise about that simple dynamic that we've all retreated inside our houses. I sometimes feel like we're a bit like we're a society that watched The Matrix and thought, what a very good idea, let's do that to ourselves. There is no substitute for a dinner with friends, watching a film at the cinema, going to the theatre. We live once. And my view is every day spent just in your house, working from home and then watching Netflix and doing nothing else is a wasted day. But on the specific point about those aggregators, they, in many instances, are the only thing standing between lots of high street restaurants and difficulty. So, it's a difficult problem to pick through. But I would say that Deliveroo are not the cause of that problem. It's a broader societal change.
No, I don't think they're the cause, but they are the delivery method, in both senses. So, for me, and I don't want to put my value judgments against anybody else, but for me, we in this household, we very rarely get takeaway. And I'm from the fish and chip industry, and I support them, but very rarely. I would rather cook at home and then go out to eat. I'd rather spend the money in a restaurant. I think that, especially if it's, let's say, Indian food, it's not going to travel as well as what I'd like if I was going to eat it there in the restaurant. I think the experience is nice. I want my children to know what it's like to eat out as well, as opposed to just having the food delivered to us by a courier of sorts. So, I don't know, I think that it's important to eat out. But actually, I read an article the other day and it said with wage increases in California that a lot of people are starting to make the distinction now of why get McDonald's delivered to home or office when they can go to a Nando's type restaurant, very casual dining, because the money's starting to look quite similar in the end, and I think people are going to have to start making those choices. And I think consumers are going to have to get with the reality of the fact that delivery costs, and I think at the moment that reality is hidden from them. They believe it's shielded from them because Deliveroo and all these lot, and not just Deliveroo, so let's just take all the aggregators. I want to blame them. They sort of cover it up. They don't realise that the shop owner, as in the supplier of the food, is already paying 20 to 38%. Because that's completely hidden from them. So one of the biggest complaints I see from a lot of my customers about those services is that those costs aren't transparent to the end user. So the end user thinks they're just paying £2.50 for whatever, and that's it. What they don't see is that the food is actually more expensive because the shop or the business restaurant has to also cover their costs. And I think it would be nice to see some more transparency from those aggregators, but they're not going to do it unless they're forced to. So,
to a degree, some of this is to do with the economics of how much money people have in their pocket as well, because at the moment people are very price sensitive, and they notice differences in price in a way that maybe in 5 years' time, when real wages have come back up again, people won't. But it's certainly true to say that it's harder to make money now from casual dining or takeaway than it has been in a while. But I also think there's some things which suggest it's easing. So real wages are beginning to get better. Inflation into food costs, not everything, but a lot of it is improving. There are things which make me think that actually the margin squeeze, which people in your old industry have seen, is getting a bit easier. And I hope so, because if my local chip shop goes, I'll be very upset.
No, I hope it does get easier on everybody, definitely. And there is signs of that. But then, ingredient costs are always shuffling all over the place, as always. But getting onto some of these topics, because we could put the world to rights for days, I think, at this rate. I think one of the main topics, at the moment, which has been banding about, and you've put it in as your by end of term change. And if we just focus on VAT for a moment, because I think for many in hospitality, looking at Twitter with chefs and people in hotel industry, and then fish and chip industry that I sort of follow quite strongly, a lot of people just want VAT reform. Your sort of VAT reform looks like, it says in your website, is to sort of look like what VAT looks like in Europe. How does that look like, do you think? How could we sell that to A, the politicians, and B, the businesses that hopefully would support that?
So hospitality is one of our biggest exporters through tourism, right? We often don't think of hospitality as an exporter, but it is. And at the moment, the VAT in a lot of Europe, not all of Europe, but a lot of Europe is rather lower rather than it is in the UK. That's that's a good argument for the reduction of VAT. More broadly, of course, we would ask the government, whoever it is, after the 4th of July, to look at the bundle of costs which businesses face. And actually, at our conference in mid-June, we had a speech by Bim Afolomi, who's the current Conservative City Minister in the Treasury, and he made what I think is a perfectly fair point, that it's costs as a whole which are the concern rather than specifically this tax, that tax. And there's some truth in that. But in a world where the government has increased business rates by twice the rate of inflation, i.e. they're charging businesses twice as much as anybody else is at the moment in increased costs. There is a question of looking around to see what levers you can pull, and VAT is one of them. The reason we've said we see it as a whole parliamentary term request is not because we don't think it's important, we think it would be transformative, but because we recognise that the financial challenge for any incoming government is severe. And if you look at the manifestos, they have all talked about not changing VAT. They've talked about not raising it. So the position that both the Labour and the Conservative Party are in at the moment is we're not going to put up VAT. So that's right now, that's the discussion. As the economy normalises and inflation continues to be low, and not just our personal incomes, but the government's income relative to its costs improves, then we can start making that case again. But we have to be realistic, I think, about the fact that if we talk about VAT now, we risk not getting the business rates reform we think we are going to get. So it's about sequencing it.
I think for me, when it comes to VAT, I think that I like the idea of it taking a whole term. I know everybody would want it immediately. Who wouldn't? Any of these reforms, you'd want them all by the next budget. But I think that the whole VAT needs complete reform. I think that, if anything, it's a bit of a mess. I mentioned to Kate a while ago that on the podcast that I think that probably what needs looking at is the fact that it could do with widening. At the moment, within hospitality, it's on sit-down food and hot food. Where in actual fact, it's called value-added tax. So if it was on everything that's value-added, that's food, that would make sense to me. So, for example, to give you an example, if I made a sandwich at home with bread bought from the supermarket, with ham bought from the supermarket, spread bought from the supermarket, there's no VAT on that. But if I go to Tesco and buy a sandwich ready, which is value-added, there's also no VAT on that. So for me, there's a logical widening of VAT. Years ago, there was the whole Pastigate thing. I don't know if you remember that with Greggs. Well, it wasn't Greggs, it was all bakers. And it's not like they got away with anything. There was a clarifying in the law, and they still fell out of, charging VAT. So I think, again, that's a luxury. You're buying food that you could have bought at home and cooked at home. So I think, for me, it's widening it. If you widen it enough, you can lower it. I think one of the concerns I have with the European-style VAT is that I understand it's, let's say, 10% on a special rate for hospitality in lots of places, but they also charge VAT on all food ingredients from the supermarket, which we don't do in the UK. And I think the thought of that in the UK would probably send people over the edge. So I think that's why we need that time to really thrash out the ideas and get it right.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. The question is, what is the purpose of a tax? And a tax is normally either to raise money or to discourage something you don't want to happen.
Yeah.
Those are the two reasons broadly that you would have a tax, right? Because if you have a tax on this but not on that, it's distortive. the issue I sort of said at the beginning that, hospitality has these non-economic benefits which are for everybody. Having a great restaurant or a great bar or whatever it is or a great hotel, whatever it is in your area, is to everybody's benefit. But those benefits don't come back to the person running the restaurant, the bar, the hotel, the catering firm, whatever it is. So we have a situation where we are levying additional taxes on hospitality. So it's the hospitality company or business person who is paying for that tax, but the benefits of that hospitality business go to the whole of society. And I don't like a situation where a big multinational like a supermarket is not seeing VAT on much of its goods in this sense, but a small hospitality business is, because what that does is it discourages those community businesses that we should be encouraging, not discouraging.
But again, it's about I guess then the tax needs to be about the product and not the company, and I think this is the problem. I guess let's just, without looking at the detail, if VAT was dropped tomorrow to 10% on hot food, I think many would be annoyed that McDonald's would be given 10% reduction, which is essentially 10% on their profits. Because let's just assume they're not going to pass it on. They've had a tough few years, and yet the local guy who sells a burger down the road is still in the same place. So I'm not 100% convinced yet. And I think I want to see a lower VAT. I just think it needs to be done in a different way. And I think the word for me, it's the two words value added. I think if we apply it to anything that's value added, then I think we've lost skew of that. And I think like you mentioned, that it's essentially a tax on expenditure. And I think, you need to spend money on food. And as much as I hate this fact, because we do supply hospitality, and I want everyone to eat in hospitality venues, no one has to eat in hospitality. We want them to. We want them to go out and enjoy themselves. And I think this is where we've just got to make the government understand that, yes, not everybody has to eat out. We want them to. So let's encourage it by having lower VAT. And then I wonder how it works with health campaigns and, how can you help pubs and nightlife when we're trying to make people drink less? And I wonder how all these policies start to clash against each other.
Yeah, no, I agree. But look, I don't think the fact that somebody isn't going to a pub doesn't mean they're not drinking. I wonder how many people,
right.
because it's cheaper, isn't it, to have some cans of Stella in the. I'm pointing here at my fridge. Cans of Stella in the fridge than it is to go to the pub. Yeah. So I don't buy that encouraging people to go out to their local pub or restaurant to have dinner or have a drink encourages drinking. In fact, being at home where you only have to walk to the fridge to get a can of, it's
probably worse.
Other beers are available, and that beer is a quarter the price. It's that may encourage dangerous drinking. I don't agree at all, actually, that encouraging. And I think I just come back to the central fact that it is in and of itself a good thing to have hospitality in a community, because it creates communities. You go out to, the people go on every year. People come back from their holidays in Europe and say, wouldn't it be lovely if London or Bristol or Manchester or Bootle or wherever was like wherever they've been on holiday? The difference is the hospitality. That's the difference. And that's the thing that we should be actively trying to encourage. And just very quickly, because the alternative is increasing strength for internationally owned businesses where both the profits and the capital value leave the country. I would much rather have a family-owned little fish and chip shop, which I have to walk half a mile to go and get my fish and chips and come back with, succeed, because the family keep the money, the people they employ in the local area get paid well, and it energizes our community centres. That should be, and I think increasingly actually we will see in this term of Parliament, it is something which all of politics agrees with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's really important to small business, and I think in my mind, it's probably the likes of the things like red tape. I think it's a hidden cost that like, I know VAT is such a big headline topic in hospitality, but I sometimes think as a small business owner that's growing and trying to build a business, a stable business, is red tape. And I think, one of the big things that I'm worried about and I'm planning for, just because obviously I think Labour is going to get in, and I'm not upset by that. Whoever gets in, gets in. You've got to run a business. You've got to have a strategy for the long term. And I think for me, one of the big things is workers' rights. And I think, Labour have been quite clear that they're really bolstering down on workers' rights. And I think that's probably going to be a strain on small business who, like if I think of the average fish and chip shop, they've got, the owner, they've got a few staff, they haven't got a HR department, they haven't got, a lawyer on speed dial, they've got maybe a bookkeeper if they're lucky, or an accountant, or someone that helps them with these things. And this is probably indicative of every small business we know. So I wonder how they're going to cope with sort of, for example, what is it? 0 day, full employment rights, banning 0 hours. One of the things with 0 hours, I just fundamentally don't think that everyone understands what they exist for. And is that because they don't get it, or is it actually abused more than I think it is?
So, yes and no. So, the Labour Party aren't proposing to ban 0 hours contracts.
Okay.
What they're proposing is that somebody who is on a 0 hours contract and is in fact working regular hours can ask for that contract to be made regular, because they recognise, as they should, actually 0 hours contracts are incredibly important to a lot of people. I think about my mum when I was a kid, who worked behind the bar of the local pub around, looking after us as a single mum, right? So 0 hours contracts are actually very socially important, and you shouldn't be in a situation where you can't be employed unless you can offer your employer regular hours. But equally, you don't want the situation where there's people who are on a contract that means they have to sit at home and wait for their employer to call them, and they could go in, get to work, be told that they're not needed anymore, and they just have to go home. You don't want that. So you don't want the exploitation.
So that's an abuse of that system.
Yeah, exactly. But they do recognise, and I think rightly, that 0 hours contracts are important. And then the day one rights thing is interesting. We'll have to keep close to this if Labour win. But they're talking about basic rights, not full rights. I think that's really important. They're not talking about doing away with notice periods or what do you call it when you start a new job? I've had a small mental block.
Yeah, now I have to, because
your first 3 months, whatever it is, probation period.
Yeah.
So they're not talking about doing away with any of that. They're saying that on day one you should have basic rights, and they name them interestingly. They say parental leave, sick leave, and you can't unfairly dismiss somebody. So you can't sack somebody for being a woman just because they're on their probation period.
But you couldn't do that anyway, could you? Surely that law is covered.
No. I mean, yes. But sick pay and parental leave, I suppose, I'm not an employment lawyer, but I suppose that's a tightened protection. But they're not talking about all rights, and they are saying that you still have a probationary period. So I think some of the detail of this, we will have to see what it looks like when the law comes. And of course, we'll read it, we'll work with them to make sure that it achieves their ambitions, which we would all share, to give people good quality, stable, well-paid work. I don't know a single employer who doesn't want to provide all of those things, absolutely. But in a way that is kind of achievable.
Is fire and rehire a thing still? Like, it sounds very American, that one. Like,
well,
I've never heard of anyone doing it, but
do you remember the P&O ferry business?
Mm-hmm.
They did it. There are instances, certainly. There are instances.
Is that because the P&O staff aren't actually British staff? They're not employed by a British company? Is that right, or something?
Well, there's something to do with being at sea, isn't there? I can't remember. Yeah. But yes, I mean, look. Yeah,
it's a bit of a trick. Yeah, legally, I don't think that's a clean one, yeah.
No, I think the what we should expect to see under a Labour government is an increased, and depending on your politics, you can say responsibility, you can say burden, to give employees a set of rights from early on in their employment, I would say that, as we understand it at the moment, it doesn't seem that onerous. And we've been working very hard with them to help them to design it in a way which achieves their goal without making it impossible to employ people. But clearly we will stick close to it in government.
I think one of the concerns is in many in hospitality is that by sort of gradually lifting the wages, and Labour's proposing to also drop the wage bands, so for anybody over 18, you just fall straight onto national living wage. Is that right? So by doing that, and then also adding these little bits, and like you say, they're not overly onerous, but when you add them all together, are we sort of making the skill level for what you get for your money, you're getting a lot lower for your money? And I understand from a society's point of view, because you want everyone to get paid really well, and I get that. But from the local chip shop, the local kebab shop, the local sandwich shop, the local restaurant, they're literally getting someone at the lowest level at almost a very high buy-in wage-wise, as in comparison to previous years. So I can just see that's obviously a big worry for a lot in hospitality.
Yeah, so the minimum wage as of the 1st of April is £23,000 a year FTE equivalent. And that's not a small amount of money. You know, if you have to sell a lot of fish and chips or a lot of coffees.
It's not small, but it's not a lot. Like,
no,
if we're looking at on the broad level,
it's a lot of money for the business. It's possibly not a lot of money for the employee in the modern world. The parties are all pretty committed to essentially maintaining that. Labour have added in their manifesto, alongside the other things that the Low Pay Commission takes into account, looking at it being a sort of a real living wage, the cost of living question. So you could have a situation where at the moment it's set at 2/3 of median income, right? So you could have a situation where 2/3 of median income is lower than the increase in the cost of living. So they haven't said how they're going to estimate it, but let's say they say, okay, let's take inflation, let's take CPI or RPI, the two kind of consumer inflation metrics. It rises by the higher of median income rises or inflation. For most of an economic cycle, that would mean that it would just carry on going at the rate it is now, i.e. a percentage of the median income, because median incomes tend to go up faster than inflation. But I think for me, all of this comes back to a bigger question, which is growth. So a McDonald's worker in the UK earns considerably less than a McDonald's worker in America, because we all earn a lot less than people in America. You know, it's amazing how much lower our salaries are than in America, because America has more income. It's a richer country. And I think for me, if I was running a business, and I appreciate it's easy for me to say, but if I was running a business, my main concern would be the ability of the economy to create jobs, which means people can afford to go out for dinner, go out for a drink, get fish and chips. And that's the bit that whoever wins on the 4th of July, we have to find a solution for.
So a friend of mine, a different friend, so they are real.
You've claimed 3 friends now, I think.
I might have to show you all their details.
I'm not convinced. Yeah,
but listeners will not be convinced either.
No.
But he always says to me, he's from Barnsley, and he won't mind me saying this, but he always says he's always voted Labour, which isn't a big giveaway because he's from Barnsley.
He's from Barnsley, yeah.
And but he said that as a business owner, he reconciles the fact that in his mind, Labour will give his customers money to spend in his shop, and Conservatives might give him lower taxes to pay, but he'd still rather have the customers spending money in his shop. And I wonder if that's the sort of things that we're going to have to get our head around.
Yeah, I mean,
that's probably more true for past years, because again, the fiscal reality isn't like the previous years.
Yes, for all of us, the challenge is economic growth, to create well-paid jobs so that people have the money to spend in our restaurants. We can have a genuine disagreement about how you get there. We have a genuine disagreement about whether that's done through investment in roads and ports and broadband and all the rest of it to make us more productive, whether it's done by cutting taxes, although none of the parties seem to be suggesting that's on the cards in any material way. But I suppose I would say to anybody, back to your point right at the beginning about politicians get a lot of stick and they're doing their best, which I think is absolutely true. I would come back to this basic thing that running a business doesn't mean you don't care about your staff's rights, pay, all the rest of it. Being an employee doesn't mean you don't care about your business being profitable. It is in the mutual interest of the businesses and employees to have a business which is growing so that it employs more people, profitable so that it can pay more, and is able to invest not just in its people but in its profits. So the business person makes money, the employees make money. That is a mutual benefit. And the benefit of doing that within hospitality, if you're a politician, is that you create those broader economic, social and community benefits.
And I think going back to earlier when you mentioned the ceiling price, I think a lot of people in hospitality, and especially fish and chips, they believe that there is a ceiling price and that it can't be breached. So if your inputs are creeping up and the ceiling price is there, and then they have to start paying people £13 an hour, for argument's sake, from 18 plus, they worry that it's going to be a struggle and there's not much left in it for them. And I think, and it's understandable, and I get it completely. So what are any of these parties proposing for increasing? Well, if we look at hospitality, it's fair to say that for the most part, they're not getting, unless you're a top restaurant or all of this, you're not getting somebody that actually wants to be in hospitality. As a worker, it's usually a second thought. And then while they get in, they like it and they start doing training courses. I think it's one of those things that you love once you're in. I don't think no one ever grows up saying, I want to be a waiter. And nobody definitely grows up unless they're in the family saying, I want to work in a kebab shop or a fish and chip shop. So but once they're in, they start to enjoy it and they like it and they start doing training courses and they start to become into it. So how can we then not feel like that these industries especially are scraping the barrel? We're going to have lower immigration from pretty much all parties moving forward. They're not going to, and if they are letting people in, it's not going to be for hospitality. It's going to be for doctors and, brain surgeons and, what they class as the top talent. So how can we then, turn it around to then say we need apprenticeships? Who's saying the right things for the future of the workforce? Yeah,
you've hit the nail on the head there, which is about respect for the sector. Respect for the sector. And you go around the world, anywhere where a society or a place has had challenges, the thing that fixes it is hospitality. And you'll often find young people, often from marginal communities, ethnic minorities, who have found smart, clever, innovative, great things which they can sell, which make them money, but also sort of regenerate communities. Think about Budapest, where those ruin bars, where people literally just put up string lights in between bombed out buildings and bought some booze and started doing these bars. And it's a bit like when the Japanese glue a pot back together with golden glue. They call it kensuke, where the crack is the thing. We've got to rediscover the idea that hospitality is of status, is of meaning, is a craft, it's creative. We talk at UK Hospitality a lot about the idea of serving Britain and the fact that hospitality is this service sector which brings meaning. And I think it would be nice to have politicians talk in those terms more. But equally, we need to be better as a sector at telling people what those opportunities are. So we've been doing a piece of work over the last year to figure out how we can do better training, which is available in a modular way to young people in particular, but frankly anybody entering the sector. There's no sector which employs more people returning to work in later life than we do as well. so that people can see it as a route to really skilled employment. So people who need just a job which fits around their life, we can provide employment to those people. But we can be a place where when you say, I want to be in hospitality, people say, brilliant, amazing. And they're proud of you. Whether that is front of house, whether it is being a cook, whether it is running or maybe one day owning your own takeaway business. There's real meaning in these things. But we need to move away from the idea as a society that a career in hospitality is anything other than a brilliant way of spending your life.
Absolutely. And I just think that there are so many difficulties. Like, are we just going to have to, as a population, just get used to the fact that it's a paradigm shift? I mentioned that, I was in Norway a few weeks ago. They pay on average for every band 12 to 13% more tax than us. They're just as unhappy when you talk to the locals. They had potholes just like we did, which annoyed a friend of mine. And you think, another one, and you think, and you've got these parties that are saying to us, we're not going to increase any headline taxes. No main taxes are going up. Are they just going to stuff us on other stealth taxes? Are they not being honest with us? Because, we all want to pay less tax, but we also want the NHS and we want better train lines and we want everything. And are we just entitled people? I'm trying to figure it all out because it just feels like, you mentioned earlier where you've got a double bed and everyone's trying to move the single bed duvet. And I relate to that. It's such a real good way to put it because I think everybody wants everything, but they want it cheaper than it's ever been. And how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes back to growth. The problem that we have in this country is not a problem unique to this country. It's true of most of the West. It's increasingly true of China as well, as their population changes. Is we have a demographic problem where we have the ratio of old people to young people is very different to it was 30 years ago, which means we have a lot of people who are retired, a generation who retired having paid themselves defined benefit pensions, which they didn't save enough for, so the working generation has to pay for it. People are living longer, so the NHS costs more. This is true for a lot of society. At some degree, what a society is people who are in work needing to pay enough to pay for themselves and the people who are no longer working. At the moment, because we have too few people in work compared to people who are retired, we need to find growth from somewhere. We need to find productivity. We need to get people into work who are not in work. We need to increase the pay of the people in work. All of this is to do with productivity and growth. There was a really good report by the Resolution Foundation on all of this last year, and it's worth reading. But it boils down to the central thing that almost every challenge that we have comes down to how do you create growth. And you talked there about, will there be stealth taxes? I think we're all looking at a possible 12 to 15 billion pounds of unfunded costs, whoever wins on the 4th of July. But I have been very impressed by the fact that in the manifestos, one of the areas of complete agreement is that hospitality businesses, high street businesses in general, actually should see their business rates reduced by increasing the business rates on online businesses. So there is a real recognition, I think, in the manifestos that in and amongst what is going to be a very challenging fiscal period, one sector that you really absolutely have to support is ours.
Absolutely. It makes sense. That does need help. And they've been struggling for a while, and probably before COVID, to be fair. And they rely on a lot of outside money. So to keep it going. But business rates seems to be one of those things that, again, it's been lingering for a while. It was, even before COVID, it was a problem, and then it just became an increasing headache after COVID. And I think one of the conclusions I've come to, and again, I'm not an economist, and I barely understand most things that I read, until someone else tells me that I'm wrong. And I think that there's just not enough people paying it. And for anybody listening to me, just give me a second to explain that. In England, you've got small business relief. So many chip shops, kebab shops, pizza shops probably don't pay it. And because, for good reason, they're small business. And then you've got warehouses that are so big that it's insignificant because they're turning over so much money. Whereas, 20 years ago, a warehouse was a warehouse, whereas now they're huge fulfillment centres. And then you've got, in Scotland, there's about 8 or 9 different categories of who doesn't actually pay for business rates. And you think, charities pay 80% less. And charities aren't just charities anymore. They're not people begging on the street for money. They're actually businesses now. A charity that sells clothes or cards next door to a clothes or card shop is a competitor. So I think one of the biggest problems is that with so many little people paying it, it falls on the likes of Wetherspoons, the cinema, all of these which have very large burdens. And then, whereas if we just started from scratch and said everybody pays it and it's X, and obviously, they have to figure out a good multiplier for like the warehouse fulfillment centres because they are businesses. But I do think it just doesn't make sense that 2 shops that next door to each other. A friend of mine in Scotland was saying he's got a small shop in a parade and he pays full rates. And it's ridiculous. He's a small business, but he actually doesn't. He's one of the 8 groups that doesn't actually get small business rate relief. So, and I know that's a devolved nation, but it is interesting that no one's really got it right out of all of our devolved nations in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, the fact, so the UK government passed the business rates reform onto Scotland as part of the what's called the Barnett consequentials, which is the sort of the prorated contribution to Scotland's budget, but Scotland, because it is a devolved government, chose to spend it on something else, which is their right. Although I wouldn't have done it myself. I think with business rates, you don't need to be that big a restaurant or pub to start paying it, because the issue, I mean, not so much if you're a chip shop and you've got your space, your fryers, and you've got the outback, and you've got a place for your staff your customers to wait. But if you're a pub, because you need to have the space for everyone to sit in, you very quickly pay business rates. Hospitality pays many multiples more of its revenues and business rates than, say, banking does. Many multiples more. And it is, weirdly, for the reasons you say, that warehouses didn't used to pay it because they were just used to be empty, an empty room full of stuff, and now it's the substance of a business. We have a situation where the tax schemes, the tax environment in the UK works to discourage people from running a business on a high street. So if you're a delivery business, you're better off now having a dark kitchen on an industrial estate, not maintaining a shop on a high street. That damages us all because the high street gets a little bit worse. But we will, I think, in the first period of a new government, whoever gets in, see a pretty fundamental change to the way the business rates are calculated, and it will be to the benefit of hospitality.
Yeah, no, I think so. So, a few thoughts before we wrap up. So we all know what's in, if you're interested, the manifestos, you've reviewed them, we've reviewed them, every man and his dog's reviewed them. People are probably going to vote how they want, and probably going to try and bloody someone's nose, and because that's the feeling out there at the moment. But do you think, is there a party out there, do you think, or even one of the promises from any of the parties that's just really impressed you? Is there anybody that's just really hit the nail on the head?
I will be very careful about endorsing a party, partly because actually the law means we have to be incredibly careful in the short campaigns. I am really pleased by the fact that the major parties have all explicitly said that they want to rebalance the business environment in favour of high street businesses and community businesses like hospitality. Also very impressed by the fact that the Labour Party have said that they will fix the apprenticeship levy so that businesses in hospitality and in other sectors can spend the levy on more piecemeal, modular, apprentice level training for their staff. So those things are really positive. I think what I'm interested in seeing is what happens after the election. And you very kindly listed our policy asks at the start of this podcast. And the first 100 days, business reform and apprenticeships, though business rates reform and apprenticeships, they are both in the manifesto. Great. But helping with employer NICs, supporting green investment, making it possible for hospitality businesses to get planning changes more quickly, and VAT. Those are all things which I think we have to work with whoever comes in to try and make happen as soon as possible.
Is there anything that wasn't in the manifestos that sort of made you think, come on, guys, you should have had a look at this?
Oh, I mean, look, we got the two things we wanted for the first 100 days in there. So, beggars can't be choosers, right? We are going to get the apprenticeship levy reform. We are going to get business rates reform. So that's great. I would like to have seen planning reform in there as well. I understand the limitations on that. I understand that. I read the same data everybody else does. But I feel that planning reform is a lever which we all recognise can be pulled quite quickly, and making it just quicker to get a planning decision would be really positive. And I think having an explicit recognition that if you want to rebuild a community, if you want to fix a high street, if you want to build a new community, if you want to do urban regeneration, you need hospitality to do that. So the easier you can make it for hospitality businesses to set up and thrive, the better for everyone.
Seeing as you're a broad political thinker, and obviously you've been involved in this, and far cleverer than me. One thought I've had recently, until someone brought it to my attention actually, they said that the levelling up sort of policy is sort of set to fail to some degree, because our councils aren't as devolved as what they should be. And if they were more devolved, then they wouldn't have to constantly go to the Treasury and say, hey, we'd like X for Y. And is that a problem to some degree? And do any of the parties talk about fixing that? Because then it could mean that, my local Atherstone council could say, hey, we want to apply for X and we're going to do this with it. And we want to move on really fast. And the Treasury won't say, well, actually, no, you can't have it for that because we control that. And I know I've massively simplified that whole process, but is that an issue that the UK isn't actually as devolved? It's a lot more centralised than a lot of devolved counties would like.
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly fair point. I ran a trade and investment agency largely funded by the Mayor of London for 5 years, and we saw this all the time. I think I'd make 2 points, though. One is perhaps the bigger problem is the fact that the major part of UK government politics to be hit by austerity and budget reductions is local government. So to a degree, they haven't got the money to use, if they had the decision making. The other thing is there is a balance, and this isn't always easy, but sometimes there's something which is in the interest of the country or a region, a development, that local people don't like so much. So, that might be something like the Madison Square Garden sphere in East London, which would have been an enormous benefit to the UK's tourism and hospitality scene. Huge development. The local community were far less keen on it because, of course, all of the challenges of having that in your community come to the community, and the benefits come to all of us. So there is something about balancing real devolution of ability to do things like think about a hospitality strategy, think about a growth strategy, know what you can put where, definitely. And I've never thought that, all of the talent of the country is in the Treasury. It isn't. It's everywhere. Talent is everywhere. But equally, we're all NIMBYs when it comes to our own backyard. We all are. So there is something about having a way of saying, actually, it's in the whole country's benefit to have Soho vibrant at night, to have the Northern Quarter in Manchester vibrant. And if you devolve all of the power too much, actually it's quite hard to get stuff done.
Yeah,
so, I mean, there are, by the way, PhDs written on this problem, but yeah, I'm very pro-devolution, having worked in local economic development for a long time.
But you can see how, like, even in that 90-second answer there, like, you can see how it has the ability to seize the gears of progress. Because if a local councillor doesn't like something, they're just going to say no. And that could have provided 40 jobs. And you think, well, 40 hospitality jobs in this instance. It could be a new cinema, a bowling alley, or with a pub. But I don't want
a nightclub.
A nightclub. I don't want that here. I don't want that here. And why would I want that here? That's terrible. Couldn't have that.
I want to go to the cinema. I just don't want the cinema near me.
Yeah.
So, and look, that's that. We are all that person. We are all that person, because it's a classic problem that the benefits accrue to everyone, the challenges accrue to the people nearby.
Well, on that note, Alan, I'd like to leave it there. You've been absolutely great. We haven't forgotten anything, have we? And, no.
It's your podcast. I've had a lovely time. So thank you very much.
Likewise. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the election next week. And at least you're not on the stage and you don't have to feel bad. You can feel bad. Well, feel bad or good for whoever else is standing.
I will order takeaway from a local restaurant and watch the exit poll with everybody else.
Well, brilliant.